Hello, everybody. Scott Golden here with Golden Opportunities Coaching. Welcome to those of you who are new. Welcome back to those of you who are seasoned veterans of what we do around here. What we do around here is we give psychological coaching and spiritual and emotional advice on a variety of topics. Please subscribe, like, comment below. If there's an audio you'd like to hear, please feel free to give details of that in comments below, and we'll usually get to it in a couple of days. It's my hope that things get a little more regular around here. I'm still working through issues with my shoulder, but in any event, I'm going to try and get more regular as we go into August specifically. But until then, we can just do what we got here, and today we're going to talk about abusive relationship, signs you're in an abusive relationship. And that's challenging because I would even classify, and having worked with 15,000 people, over 5,000 couples, I would say that the number of people that are in a borderline abusive relationship is 60 to 70%, which is really high when you think about it. Maybe even higher. That's just the sample size of people I've worked with. But abusive relationships are becoming more and more the norm in today's society, and the reason for that, at least in my opinion, is simply because so many people put pressure on relationships as a form of their own happiness or their own fulfillment. And so when a person doesn't fulfill those goals, it's easy to abuse a person. Also, the pressures in modern day society versus 40, 50 years ago, I think have increased greatly for a number of reasons, and that brings out personality disorders. Also, we look at things like biological changes, the chemicals in our food, the rise in mental illness, and there's a myriad of reasons why people are unkind to each other. So what are some signs that you're in an abusive relationship? We're going to go through about 7 or 8 of those today. If you are, please reach out for help. There's domestic violence shelters, and that applies to men and women, not just women. There's a misnomer in Western society specifically that victims are always women. That's not always the case. Also, if you have left an abusive relationship, please find a counselor, minister, coach, somebody to work with to help you process those emotions. If you're trying to process them alone, you're actually 4 times more likely to go into another abusive situation in the future until you figure out what led you there to begin with, and who the heck wants to go through that multiple times, right? Some people go through it for decades before they break the cycle. Anyway, the use of force. Now, force can be mental, emotional, or physical. Mental force is just wearing you down to the point where you can't survive without taking the other person's opinion or viewpoint into effect. Mental force is also just feeling exhausted constantly when dealing with a person. Physical force, obviously, we know is the threat of physical damage, harm, or assault, or the actual carrying out of such an action. Emotional force, the use of guilt, bargaining beyond boundaries, the use of insults and reverse psychology on a consistent basis, the use of forcing someone through making them feel as though they are the only option for something or the only option for a relationship. All of these are forceful approaches, and they are abusive in nature. Now, the next one goes with that, control. So, obviously, what is a controlling person? A controlling person is an individual who has a very set, rigid viewpoint of how another person should behave, and they will act in ways that cause a person to behave in this way. Controlling mechanisms usually begin very simply. They start as preferences, and then they become ultimatums, and then they become control mechanisms. So, here's how this works. Hey, I really don't like when you wear tight jeans. Okay, so that's a preference, right? Like, I've expressed how I feel, and then it becomes, I've mentioned this to you before, I really don't like those tight jeans. If you do that again, we can't see each other. So now it's an ultimatum. You have a choice to make about whether or not to do what the person has asked you to do or not, with a negative consequence associated with not doing as they have requested or asked. And then it becomes a control mechanism. My standard is don't wear tight jeans. and I'm going to leave you if you even think about doing it. Now it becomes built into you that there's no option under which you can ever wear that clothing or do that thing or talk to that person. So that's how control takes over. It's actually a three-tiered force. It's a three-tiered boundary or breaking a boundary. And then another one is excuses. So an abusive person will say something like, just as an example, well, I only yelled at you because I had a hard day at work, or I only yelled at you because I'm having problems with my ex-wife, my ex-husband. I'm only yelling at you because you never listen to me. And there's always an excuse behind the rationalization. Now, people can change away from that behavior with self-reflection, but here's the thing that's kind of dangerous. Excuses can be intermittent, and this is where people get tripped up. So, let's suppose I yell at somebody because they've engaged in a certain behavior. And I say, well, I yelled at you because the last person that did this to me ended up cheating on me, and I don't want to get cheated on again, da-da-da-da, but I'll work on it. So they've shown self-reflection. They've come back after some time, several minutes, several hours, maybe even a couple of days, and given self-reflection. And then a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later, they do the same thing. Excuses also can be intermittent, meaning a person can show temporary change to fake you out or to show that or to give the illusion that they are changing their behavior when in reality that's never the case. So it's important to realize that excuses aren't always daily or weekly or monthly. Sometimes they're intermittent, and that contributes to you doubting where a person is, essentially being honest versus being dishonest, and that gets into really, really muddy water for lots of people. Another thing an abusive person will do is push boundaries. Whatever your boundaries are, and I tell people this all the time, and a lot of people say I'm anti-compromise in this, and that is, nothing could be further from the truth. But I tell people to have 3 levels of boundaries. So the unbreakable boundary. These are the things I will not tolerate. These are the things that have nothing to do with how I feel about you. This is just not for me. I'll give you an example of mine. I won't date somebody who doesn't at least have some form of career plan and has been working a job for at least 6 months. And I don't care if they've fallen on a hard time. They can have a plan to get back on their feet. Okay, here's my plan. I have to see them working the plan. That's a hard stop for me. And then the second level of boundaries is my negotiable boundaries. And one of my negotiable boundaries is I've got to get my phone. I will be back momentarily, folks. Taking a time out to take that client was really helpful because it leads into my next topic for this particular audio, and that is love bombing. Just spent some time talking with a client about that. Had a little mini session of about half an hour. But anyway, love bombing is the idea that if a person who is an abuser gets power through giving of love, gets power through constant validation, constant compliments, constant physical affection, mental validation, emotional support, and they do it over and over and over again, but they're doing it really quickly before there's actually a solid foundation for them to want to do this or have a tendency to do this. That's known as love bombing, and an abuser will do this once they figure out what your weaknesses are, what the points that you have not forgiven yourself for in previous relationships are, and then they will use that as leverage to make you think they are more committed or more ready to commit than they actually are. This is especially common in younger relationships or rebound relationships where a person is trying to get into another relationship really quickly to get over a previous partner. That's why, and it's not a popular belief, but I always tell people to take at least six months between long-term relationships, and I know a lot of people don't do that, but it's also the reason why relationships become so toxic, because if you haven't taken time for self-reflection, then ultimately, at the end of the day, you're going to repeat, or you're more likely at the very least to repeat repetitive cycles. And love bombing is one way that you do um, have a higher chance of repeating repetitive cycles. The idea being that this person, the abuser, is using your desire to be loved as a way to control you, as a way to manipulate outcomes, as a way to make you think, hey, I'm more secure than I was. That means I'm ahead. That means I'm good now. And so there's a weakness that's being exploited there. Gaslighting is another one. Gaslighting is a topic that I probably should do a whole video on, but the idea of gaslighting is getting you upset just to see where your boundaries are, getting you upset just to kind of see how they can reel you back in. And this is usually something like very high intense conversations followed by high intense apologies. So it's a roller coaster ride, and it's pressing buttons just to learn the map of how to de escalate someone and also how to escalate them. Because if an abuser knows how to manipulate emotions, then they can manipulate outcomes. That's the bottom line on gaslighting. Obviously, a much more detailed process and explanation would be necessary. But if you notice someone who is very intense, you get into a lot of arguments with them quickly, followed by grandiose apologies and gift giving. Yeah, you're in the gaslighter cycle, and that's not a good thing. The last one, as we close out here, obviously is self-harm or the threat thereof. Self-harm is any behavior that is physically, emotionally, or mentally dangerous to the other person and or the threat thereof. So this can show itself as over drinking, over use of illicit drugs, physical harm such as hitting, cutting, or other forms of self-injury, and etc. and so forth. The threat of self-harm is an abuser's way to ultimately punish the person for expecting boundaries to be kept. So usually this looks like, if you do X, I will do Y. There's always an ultimatum associated with self-harm, and the blame never ends, because at the end of the day, the person engaging in that behavior is looking for you, the victim, to take responsibility for their actions. Once they know you'll do this once, the behavior will escalate. So understanding that even, oh, I got through this with this person, they'll never say it again, they'll never do it again. That's a huge lie. The likelihood of threat of self-harm replicating itself is 89%. And so that's something to look at. If you are dealing with a person in relationship that has that behavior. And so just to close out for today, I encourage you, if you are coming out of an abusive situation, please get the appropriate help, whatever that is for you. It's different for every person. And until next time, I encourage you, keep your feet on the ground, your mind in the moment. Until next time, everybody.